Okay, here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Welcome to you if you're new. Everybody else, what's up? Thanks for listening today. How are we doing? How is everyone feeling? I am doing much better than last week. You can probably hear in the sound of my voice already. Those of you who've been around long enough, you can tell I'm doing a little better than I was last week. I don't really want to talk about it because I don't want to jinx nothing. But we had a few positive signs and we had a little bit of relief and we really needed it. So I'm grateful, and thanks again to those of you who reached out. It really means so much and fills my heart when listeners take a moment to reach out and express their care and support. And it really does help me emotionally and spiritually. So thank you to anybody who ended up doing that last week. I really appreciate it. And it's so interesting to me how when I'm not completely overwhelmed by one thing or another, whether it's dealing with my daughter's situation or any other number of things that might overwhelm me, how my ability to take things in is limited. Kind of reminds me of how when I got sick recently and I was down in bed for that period of time while I was sick, my usual pains were gone. Like I normally deal with chronic pains in my hip and in my spine. But when I was sick, or even just recently dealing with some of the more extreme moments with my daughter, like for periods of time, like those usual pains in my body go away because I don't know, the immediate moment is overwhelming me or demanding so much of my attention that my body seems to prioritize it. Like it can only deal with so much at one time. And then, of course, when I got better or now that things have eased, they come back again. They're not gone. Those pains are still there, even though they've gone away for a time. I remember asking like a pain science person about that, why it seems like if I get injured in my shoulder, my usual chronic hip pain will go away for a time. And then when my shoulder feels better, it comes back. Like, what's that all about? Well, in any case, I think of that in a more macrocosmic way too, that when I'm overwhelmed with things, I can't take in the bigger picture as much. And honestly, I've sort of been avoiding the bigger picture a lot of the time these days. You know, it was always a thread on this show that I was interested in talking about, not just the philosophy and teachings of yoga, not just the heart of it for those of us who are passionate in study, but also just the realities of the market, you know, that so many of us have made yoga a profession, that there are some of us who've managed to like pay our rent over the years as yoga teachers, and that involves socioeconomics and politics. And I was always having those conversations. You can go back and read 10 years of blog posts where I was often commenting and wanting to facilitate conversation around these more, I don't know what you call them, mundane, socioeconomic aspects of yoga being not just a practice, but also being a profession. In fact, I think if you go back and look at the history of this show, I believe it was the third episode was with Richard Carpel, shortly after he was relieved of being the president of the Yoga Alliance. And we talked about, you know, issues with standards, and we talked about the problems with not-for-profit organizations and a range of different things that had to do with industry. And then over the years, I've had the spokesperson for Yoga Alliance and other presidents come on. And, the conversations were always around, again, standards and hours and all that. But eventually, those conversations about the industry, they stopped being so much about those questions and more about like social justice issues, like very overtly political. And, when Me Too hit the yoga world, I had a whole bunch of conversations coming on, people exposing the abuses of the gurus. And then not so long ago when we had George Floyd murdered, I had people on the show to talk about structural racism, because these were always relevant on some level. If yoga practice is about people in their lives and being well, all of these things are factors that play in there affecting us. This is our environment, a lot of us. We're not removed from politics and economics. It's affecting us, and so it seemed appropriate that as yoga teachers, we would also have conversations around this. And I think that's a very honest thing that yoga teachers sometimes do. If you've got people showing up and we're all experiencing anxiety around a collective thing that's happening, then to acknowledge that, it makes sense. But there's another thing that started happening, because especially once the pandemic hit, where it wasn't so much about acknowledging what we're going through, but actually like championing causes and suggestions that if you are a yogi, that equals certain political views or ideas. And, I think that myself, I've really wanted to avoid the fact that politics has come into the yoga space, as it has with a lot of different sectors, not just yoga. And it's not just politics. Like, there's always been politics in the yoga space on some level. Again, I'm not one of these people who believes you can completely separate people's like spiritual views from their politics. Like, it's interwoven. What I mean is that the politics is coming into the yoga space in a specific way, with a specific kind of like identity politics and like the cultural polarization aspects that come with that. Honestly, like the last couple emails that I got from Yoga Alliance were all overtly political. We're leaning into ahimsa, hashtag no more gun violence. And hey, I'm not in favor of gun violence. I think there should be more regulations around guns. But at the same time, it struck me that the trade organization for the entirety of the yoga profession, as some people think of it, is putting out overt political statements. And then there's lots of talk of certain things that should be included in yoga teacher training. And, I just think that there should be some conversation around this. And the way that it is now, and it's certainly been talked about before, the Yoga Alliance is not a democratic organization. Members don't get to vote on stuff. The only thing I ever voted on for the Yoga Alliance is the current logo. Many people who listen to this may not realize this, but that the logo for the Yoga Alliance was voted on. In fact, membership submitted designs, and then we voted on which ones we liked, and then we voted on which one it was going to be. And the one that I wanted wasn't the one that got picked, but I actually warmed up to it in a way. When you're part of the process, you get to have a vote. It's different than when it seems to come down from on high. In any case, all of this is to say that I do think that there's a lot of politics in the yoga space, and I've been kind of keeping my head in the sand. And if you're not interested in hearing a conversation about this, then, you should just turn this off now. Come back again next week, because I am going to return to yoga philosophy and the specifics of how we are practicing certain things and spirit. And I've got episodes in the can. Next week, we're going back there, I promise. But this week, we're going to depart a little bit. We're going to dip into the sticky waters. And what prompted it is not just me feeling like I've had my head in the sand, although that's part of it. It's that I got a number of emails from people giving me this link to this article saying, hey, have you seen this? It was this article in Unheard called The Cruel World of Yoga, and it was all about politics coming into the yoga space. And it felt like a important conversation to be having. So I reached out to the author, and that is who my guest is today. Her name is Kat Rosenfield. And when I reached out to Kat, I knew almost nothing about her. I had done a little bit of searching around. All I could find was some of her journalism credentials, but she has a very low digital footprint, I think on purpose. And frankly, I've been a little bit nervous about bringing politics back onto the show, because the last times I did, it went south. But I got another one of those emails that was overtly political, and then I had a conversation with the teachers in my weekly teachers call that I conduct, and it just seemed like it was worthwhile for us to consider some of these things so that we can have clear directives about how we want to proceed with ourselves as teachers in relationship to these cultural mores and politics. So, in any case, I was glad to have this conversation with Kat, and I think it's important to share it with you today. Real quick, before we get to that, I do want to express some gratitude to Podcast Premium subscribers. For those of you who are newer around here, the last 52 episodes of the show, the last year of episodes is always on the public feed. But we do also have a premium subscription that we offer, which is choose your rate, cancel at any time, and it's a way to access the full archives, but also to support the show. We don't do other Patreon stuff. It's a way for people who appreciate the show to contribute to it, and I don't think that we would still be doing it for as long as we have been without that kind of support. We're very grateful to everyone who does that. I would like to specifically shout out today Jacqueline Gilby and Katerina Adolf. Thank you so much, Jacqueline and Katerina. We appreciate your support. Thank you. And if you also want to become a Podcast Premium subscriber, you can find out more about that along with all of my other stuff, my ongoing classes and discussions. Everything that I'm doing can be found at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, y'all. Like I said, if this particular cup of tea does not suit your palate today, just tune out, and I don't blame you. I've been tuning out of it for like the last year. So I totally understand if you're not feeling this one. Come back again next week. But if you can get your mind around considering these topics, that's what we're doing today. So I will touch base with you on the other side, as I like to do. We'll have a little debrief. But for now, let's go ahead and get to it. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Kat Rosenfield. Hello?
Hello.
Hello, Kat. Hi, I'm Jay. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
I am already recording. I want you to know that I'd like to consider us having just begun. Don't say anything you don't want other people to hear, okay?
Okay, sounds good.
Okay.
I have to apologize. My dog is doing some barking in the background. Hopefully, he won't be too irritating, but he is making some noise.
It's okay. I've got like lawnmowers and dogs in my background too. The unavoidable. It's fine. I'm not going for like a in studio sound. You're at home and I'm at home, it sounds like.
Yeah, well, I guess it contributes to the whole kind of off the cuff, casual nature of the conversation. So that's not a bad thing.
I suppose. But me telling you that we're recording like that at the beginning is new. I used to try to capture, like I wouldn't tell people. And then later on they would say, oh, when are we going to begin? I'd say, we already have. And it was like this kind of fun thing. But as time went on, that actually sort of became problematic because then people would have said things and they would be upset. They don't want me to let other people hear it. So.
Gotcha.
It's interesting how the gonzo realism over time had to change or whatever.
Well, people are very cautious, I think, now about saying anything that might come back to haunt them.
Exactly. And, Kat, just for you to know why you're here, why I reached out to you, because your article that you recently published in Unheard entitled "The Cruel World of Yoga" has been making rounds. More than one person sent me a link to it. And when I was clicking around after I first read the article, just randomly, I had seen you on a little segment on The Hill, or whatever. From a few weeks earlier, I had seen that randomly too. And for me, I just really appreciated that someone had written something about the yoga world in the way that you did. I was religious about keeping a blog for over 10 years, up until the end of last year, really. And it was very much about looking at the profession and the industry and kind of different things that were happening. But like you said, over time, and for myself, after like a couple of very serious cancellation campaigns over episodes of this show, I kind of have felt like, I don't know, I really questioned it. So when I saw your writing, I was like, oh, well, somebody's doing it. It kind of brought me back to another time when people were writing stuff in a little bit more like, I don't know, less careful. I don't know if it was by less careful, but a more free way. I felt like I could write whatever I wanted. So in any case, that's long-winded. I guess I'm curious because I know that you don't just write about the yoga world, but it seems like this particular article about the yoga world fit in with other things that you've written about that are happening in our culture and politics, I guess.
Yes, that's very true. This article was actually an interesting case of my worlds colliding a little bit in a way that I tend not to allow them to do. I teach yoga offline, obviously, in my real life. And I don't usually allow my yoga life and my writing life to intersect in this way. I try to keep them very separate. But my editor at Unheard reached out to me because she knew that I was also a yoga instructor. And she said, things are getting a little bit peculiar in my yoga classes. I feel like things are getting overtly political in a way that I didn't anticipate ever happening in a space like this. And have you noticed this? Is this a thing? Is this something you could write about? And I said, yes, you're not crazy. You're not imagining things. And so I have written about, this dynamic and this kind of cultural, capture happening in different spaces, different communities. And so, this was a chance to sort of let my interests combine a little bit and to write about the dynamics in certain corners of the yoga world.
Wow, that's very interesting. That in getting ready to talk to you, I didn't see anywhere that you were a yoga teacher.
No, I teach under a pseudonym, actually.
Wow. So you really do keep them separate, because I try to do a little bit of research and get prepared to talk to people, but I had no idea that you were a yoga teacher. That's very interesting. How long have you been, how long has yoga been in your life?
I started practicing seriously about 10 years ago. I had a medical crisis that did things to my body that I was displeased with, and that really just made me feel like I was sort of the occupant of a vehicle that had, everything started going awry and I wasn't in control of it anymore. So getting into yoga and, the sort of brain-body connection and the focus on breathing really helped me sort of reintegrate myself with my physical self, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And then I decided that I wanted to get certified to teach. I really love the practice, and I love to be in a physical space with other people doing yoga. To be able to lead a class was really, it just kind of filled my soul up, to realize that I could share this with people. So I got certified to teach. And at the time also, I was working as a journalist, but the industry is a little odd. It's always contracting. It does not feel like a particularly stable source of employment. So I think at the time, I'll get certified to teach yoga. I will have this separate income stream. Surely nothing could ever happen to make yoga studios close or yoga classes go away. Best laid plans, obviously. So I've been certified to teach for, I guess, maybe about 5 years now.
I see. And where was that? Where were you going to classes when you started 10 years ago? And where did you do training?
This was all in Connecticut, in Fairfield County.
I see. And was the studio you're at, did you have like a home studio? Was it like a vinyasa style? I'm just sort of curious, like what your practice looked like, or what kind of yoga practice you were attracted to.
Yeah, I was a dancer when I was younger, and so I think that's sort of what attracted me to yoga particularly. I love the choreography of it and the flow, and the continuous movement. I love the transitions as much as I love, the asana. And I'm not a very woo yoga teacher. I don't talk about that stuff too much because, it was very much a body-focused thing for me when I first started. So my home studio actually closed during the pandemic. But that was where I did my training. It was called Jate. And I believe that the owner there was Ashtanga trained, but she did more of a sort of a holistic, a little bit of everything kind of an education, and let us sort of develop our own teaching style from there.
Right. Hybriding. Everybody was hybriding. And I guess it's interesting to me also because it seems like what happened for journalism also happened for like all my musician friends, and then also happened for like yoga teachers in terms of the advent of the internet and like the disruption on what used to be a more like analog grassroots infrastructure of a profession or something. And I heard you in another interview talking about how you had thought about you wanted to be a copywriter, but that industry kind of fell apart.
Oh, I could have probably, had I been trying to do that at a different time, I think it would have worked out. But unfortunately, I decided that I wanted to be a copywriter at the exact moment that the economy imploded in 2008. So I had to pivot.
Right. Well, I'm curious about the pivot in terms of you started doing your freelance writing, which you continue to do to this day. And I'm wondering, when that happened, when you made that pivot, did you have an idea in mind about what you wanted to write about?
Well, at the time I was interested in art, interested in writing about art. I majored in art in college, and, I was very centered on, the first freelancing I did was for design magazines, and I did book reviews for them. But once I realized that I wanted to write, this was also kind of the peak blogging era. I don't know if you were extremely online at this time, but everybody had a blog.
Yes, I was part of the yoga blogosphere. It was very extensive, and a lot of the conversations that I sort of have on this show used to be common threads, but that was a long time ago.
Yeah, exactly. So I started writing personal essays on a blog that has, long since been removed from the internet. But I realized that I connected to writing and that I was relatively good at it. I mean, certainly better at it than I am at anything else. And so I started just, getting jobs from freelance job boards, Media Bistro and Craigslist, and basically any place that would pay me. My only rule was that I wouldn't write for free. So I just started making a living basically by kind of scraping together all of these different projects, different income streams. I did some copywriting ultimately for a few small brands, startups, artists who were putting together statements or press kits, where they needed somebody to help them integrate that. And I started working on a novel. For a little while, I was a copywriter at a Korean electronics company. I had an advice column on a site called Spark Notes. It was basically just, anything that I could do to kind of flex that muscle and make a living. So what I ultimately ended up doing was falling backwards into a job at MTV News. I had been writing for one of their blogs for $15 a post. And they decided to shut down all the blogs, but bring a couple of writers into their news staff. And that was how I got my first freelance staff reporting job. So I was an entertainment writer at that point, and I was writing about movies and television and Hollywood gossip. And the way that I segued into writing about culture was basically that pop culture and politics started to kind of intersect in certain ways. The earth sort of started to move under my feet a little bit. The culture wars started to creep into basically everybody's pop culture coverage. And soon it was very difficult to write about art without also writing to a certain extent about politics, which is where I've sort of found myself at this point as more of a cultural commentator, although I still weave a lot of pop culture commentary into my work. That was a very long-winded answer. I'm sorry.
No, it was good.
It's been a journey.
It was good. And it's sort of why I reached out to you, because that's what happened to me. Like I was always trying to write about what felt like the zeitgeist of the yoga world or whatever. And at a certain point, it became inherently political. And even here on this show, I remember even before the pandemic hit, there was a huge Me Too wave that came through the yoga world. Mm-hmm. And I would have all these people on from the different yoga traditions. And I would ask them, what do you think about the guru who abused this woman? Or I'd have someone come on and talk about this guru who sexually assaulted them. And at a certain point, it was almost like if someone comes on the show and they have said nice things about a teacher at some point who's done bad things, if I don't kind of confront them about that, if I don't call them out about it or say, why didn't you say anything at the time, or kind of like hold their feet to the fire in some kind of like journalistic way, I'm then platforming them and like promoting whatever it was, and it just seems like what you said happened in a lot of worlds, but it definitely happened in the yoga world too. Back to you writing this article, it seems like yoga spaces did get very political. Do you think that's just because it happened with everything in the culture and yoga's became part of pop culture?
I see what's happened in yoga as maybe partly subject to the cultural influences that govern, what's happened in art and so on and so forth. But I also think that what's happened in the yoga community has a lot to do with a certain type of social dynamic that tends to creep into spaces where women gather. This is, a working theory that I have. I've seen this happen in a bunch of different places to a bunch of different kinds of communities, that where you have a lot of, sort of upper middle class, educated, liberal, usually white women. You often end up with this type of, I don't want to say toxic, but it often can be social dynamic kind of taking hold.
And what is that dynamic? Like what's taking hold? What's this? How would you describe it?
I guess I would describe it as the sort of a hyper awareness of social justice issues, followed by the weaponization of those issues and that language by a smaller contingent of people who figured out that they can use that as a sort of a vehicle for self-promotion, self-aggrandizement, sometimes for doing harm to people who they see as opponents, who they would like to see removed from influence. And I think that's sort of the trajectory.
Yeah, I guess it seems like it's hard to tell because I've seen instances where, like yoga center owners, I'm thinking back to stuff that you've written about, even where, the Black Lives Movement also had a huge wave through the yoga world. And I had people on the show talking about anti-racism and that kind of work and decolonization and all, had a number of conversations around that. Because I think that, most yoga-minded people really do like kind of believe in what's at the heart of these causes, believe that all people should be treated equal and believe in like the broad idea of justice for people,
Mm-hmm.
But then there's also, like you're kind of referring to, all this sort of marketing that happened where there's sort of a virtue signaling that would be happening. And even sometimes it seems like when people were really trying to do right, they still were sort of like, thrown under a bus of sorts. You could have wrote about that in your article, some about the kindness yoga guy in Colorado, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think that there is a certain amount of demonstrably people who try to do the most, open themselves up to being targeted because they're seen as vulnerable for that reason.
Isn't that interesting? But those folks, I guess sometimes it just has to do with like my white privileged status or something, that you're supposed to let other people have voice and sit back or something.
Well, I mean, if you have to believe in white privilege also, like you have to be very sensitive from the outset to this type of allegation of having done something wrong. And I think that that's really what unites the various communities in which stuff like this takes hold. I've seen these reckonings sweep through a lot of different spaces, and it seems that what they have in common is not that they're hotbeds of racist white supremacy. They rarely have much, if any, overt racism in them at all, but the people in these communities are very, very sensitive to these allegations. They want to do the right thing. They care a lot about having the right politics and about adhering to these sort of progressive pieties that we all consider so important. And so that's why they're the ones who end up sort of on the chopping block, because, people will take a swing at them knowing that it will land.
Right. Like if you're some total whatever right-winger person, it doesn't matter if people take swings at you, but if you actually believe in the causes, it hurts.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess, I don't know, it seemed like for a long time, the yoga world was we kind of stayed out of the politics. It seemed like it was about personal development and like self-care. When did that become political?
I think at the same time that self-care became political. I mean, really in the wake of Donald Trump's election, I think that there was an enormous amount of pressure in any space that was dominated by politically liberal people to come out sort of swinging against everything it seemed that Donald Trump stood for. It wasn't enough to just cast your vote and then go back to going about your business. There was this sense that, politics was the most important thing. It was who you were. And I think that, you saw this sweep through a lot of different communities where people were being urged to not just be much more vocal and confrontational about their politics, but to cut ties with people who didn't share their politics. It was just a shift. It was a shift in the way that we engage with each other. I think it was the start of a decline that's still ongoing in social trust. And it came for the yoga world the same way as it came for everywhere else.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. And I think for myself, I remember for my whole adult life, I was a registered independent. And then in 2016, I changed my registration to Democratic so I could vote in the primary in New York for Bernie.
Oh.
And I was totally disenfranchised by that strange procedural move they made where they changed the date of when you could change your party to vote in the primary. Like, I'd done it in September, and then after I'd done it, they changed the date and I was no longer able to. So I actually didn't even get a chance to vote in that primary.
Oh.
And I guess I mention it, and I've actually, since the 2020 election, after what happened to him that second time around, I actually have changed it back to independent. I currently live in Pennsylvania. I live in a blue beacon, a very bright blue beacon in Pennsylvania, because it's right next to a college. And I think that for myself, what becomes so uncomfortable is that I don't really see sometimes the support of either political party, but the Democratic Party, because it seems like that's more predominant in the yoga world, as actually supporting the causes. Like, to me, it all really appears like a 3-card monte game, and whether the person on the other side of the table who's shuffling the pieces is on your side of the political dynamic or not, the people standing next to you on the other side of the table who are supposedly on your side are in on it. Like, it all seems to be serving sort of corporate interests and kind of like the benefit of the power structures to kind of keep us all at odds amongst ourselves or amongst each other.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So you see this as more sort of sloganeering and almost what's the word, woke capitalism than a true commitment to advancing progressive causes.
I mean, I just look at the sort of progressive wing, like the Squad, and how much they seem to have not used whatever power they have to advance what they said they stood for when they were coming into office. I was a huge AOC fan, Mm-hmm. I'm starting to feel more and more disappointed in the same way that happened with Obama. Like it seems like, I don't know. I avoid having these conversations because I'm just a yoga teacher, and what does my opinion matter in this? But I feel like the progressive causes, I don't hear anybody talking about healthcare for people, how we're going to help people with healthcare. It seems like we're talking about sending money to Ukraine. And I'm like, what are we talking about anymore? I don't even know.
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people feel that way.
I guess when you wrote this article about the yoga world, you specifically wrote about this guy in Colorado. Do you remember the story of what happened there?
Yeah, this was the owner of Kindness Yoga. I believe his name was Patrick Harrington, white guy in Colorado who owned a chain of yoga studios. I think he had 9. And he was on the verge of reopening after what was a terrible year. It was a terrible year for every, small business owner, but especially those who have, fitness-oriented businesses. We were all forced to lock down, close their doors, go exclusively online if that was available. So, in this moment of financial struggle, was on the verge of reopening his studios. And then the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis happened, and the Black Lives Matter movement began to kind of...
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.